Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students of the European Civilization course, today we are going to complete our discussion of Plato's writings. Let's begin by page number 95, European Civilization course, مادة الحضارة الأوروبية, page number 95. Plato's The Iron. Plato's most systematic comments, most organized comments on poetry occur in two texts. So he specialized two books to speak about poetry, separated by several years. The first one of the books, of the two books, is Ion, where Socrates, his master, because as we mentioned last time, he wrote this kind of book in the form of a dialogue between himself and his master Socrates. He wants to imagine Socrates as giving him many answers to the many questions he gives, where Socrates cross-examines. Cross-examines means interrogates or investigates. بيستجوب. Whom does Socrates investigate or interrogates, cross-examine in this book? A rhapsody. Who is a rhapsody? A singer and interpreter, or sometimes a performer of poetry or drama. So a rhapsody means a singer, an interpreter, or a performer of poetry or drama. This rhapsody is called Ion. Okay, what does he interrogate this rhapsody about? On the nature of his art, on the nature of poetry. The second of the two books, of course, more sustained. The second one is more sustained, well established. Commentary occurs in the Republic. The second book is called The Republic. We will come to that later on. The Republic, the second book on poetry. Well, in the Ion, Socrates points out that the rhapsody, like the poet himself, is in a state of divine position. The rhapsody is in a state of divine position, divine control. There's a linkage between that rhapsody and the mythical gods of the Greek civilization, the Greek culture at the time, and speaks not with his own voice. This rhapsody, according to Plato, doesn't speak in his own voice. This is not the voice. These are not the words of the rhapsody, which is merely a medium. His voice is merely a medium, wasila, okay, through which a god, a supreme god speaks, a mythical god speaks. Okay, so this rhapsody, the Ion, is a mere medium. The muse, M-U-S-E, who is a muse? The muse is one of the 9 goddesses who serve the god of poetry and music, Apollo. Apollo is the god of music and poetry and is served by 9 muses, female goddesses called muses. Any one of these muses inspires the poet. And pay attention to this hierarchy, this series. From the top, the muse inspires the poet, who in turn passes on this inspiration to the rhapsody. يعني في البداية يوحي ذلك الإله في عقيدتهم إلى الشاعر الكلمات أو الشعر، ثم يوحي الشاعر الكلمات أو الشعر إلى the rhapsody. the performer or the interpreter, okay, the singer who sings the piece of poem. And this rhapsody who produces an inspired emotional effect. He causes a certain emotional effect on a fourth element in this chain, okay, who is the spectators, the listeners, the viewers. Okay, so we have the muse who inspires the poet, and the poet inspires the rhapsody of the performer, the singer, and then this rhapsody inspires the spectators. Socrates likens this process يشبه تلك العملية to a magnet بالمغناطيس which transmits ذلك المغناطيس ينقل its attractive power to a series of iron rings. So we have a magnet. And this magnet is attached to a series of iron rings. سلسلة من الحلقات المعدنية. We have a magnet to which is attached a series of iron rings, which in turn pass on the attraction or the influence on other rings suspended from the first set of rings. The muse, this is of course a kind of a metaphor, استعارة. The muse stand for this magnet, هذا المغناطيس, or lodestone. The lodestone is a magnetic stone. Okay, so the muse is the magnet. The poet is the first ring attached to the magnet. The rhapsody is the middle ring, and the audience is the last and final ring. Okay, so we have the magnet, who is the muse, or which is the muse. The first ring, the poet. The second ring, the rhapsody. The third ring, the audience, or the listeners, or the viewers. In this way, the poet conveys and interprets the utterances, okay, what is said by the gods, the mythical gods of Athens. And the rhapsody interprets the poets. So it's a series of interpretations. Okay. The poet interprets the message of God, and the rhapsody interprets the message of the poet. Okay. Hence, we can say that the rhapsodies are interpreters of interpreters. مفسرين لمفسرين آخرين. It's a series of interpretations. The poet, insists Socrates, is a light and winged thing, and holy, مقدس, and never able to compose poetry, of course, تأليف الشعر, and is never able to compose until he has become inspired. And of course, the poet becomes inspired when the inspiration comes to him from the muse, the god, and is beside himself, okay, alone, all alone. And reason is no longer in him. So he becomes a kind of a sort of a mad person. There is no reason in him, according to Plato. Okay, the poet is no longer reasonable. Okay, with no reason, لا منطق. Not only poetry, according to Socrates, but even criticism. So poetry and criticism. Criticism is irrational. Okay? irrational. Irrational here means metaphysical and divine. Okay, cannot be grasped by them, cannot be understood by the human intellect or the human mind. Hence, in this early dialogue, okay, in this book, The Iron, Plato has already sharply separated the provinces of poetry and philosophy. He has set his own distinctions. He has set a borderline. Okay? He has separated between poetry and philosophy. He is in favor of one and is not in case of the other. The former, which is poetry, has its very basis in a divorce from reason. Poetry is divorced from reason. Poetry is a source of madness. Okay? It causes madness to the poet himself and to the people who listen to this poet. Which is this reason, okay, which is the realm of philosophy. Unlike philosophers who possess reason, logic, quite reasonable. Philosophers are reasonable, logical, use logic, depend on logic, and so they are not mad. Poetry, in its very nature, he explains why does he say so. Why is this harsh judgment on poetry? Poetry, in its very nature, is steeped, is full of emotional transport, emotional sensations, and lack of self-possession, lack of self-control. The man or the poet doesn't control or doesn't have control over himself, over his emotions. Okay? Now we move on to discuss Plato's Republic, the second book written by Plato is the Republic. On page number 96. Plato's main concern in the Republic is to define justice, number one, and the ideal nature of a political state. So in this book, in the Republic, the major theme of this book is the definition of both justice, the word justice, the conception of justice, and the conception of a political state, Interestingly, his entire conception of justice arises explicitly in opposition to poetic authority and tradition. So his conception of mafhumu li, his conception of justice contradicts the nature of poetry. Okay? Socrates mentions an ancient quarrel between philosophy on one hand and poetry. Socrates, his master, the master of Plato, mentions in this book, The Republic, that there was, before that, a quarrel, a conflict between poetry and philosophy. But how? In what sense? What kind of quarrel or conflict? Plato views poetry as a powerful force. A powerful force means an influential force, an effective force. Effective in what? Or powerful in what? In molding public opinion, in forming public opinion. It has an emotional power on the people. Okay? And sees, of course, poetry, sees it as a danger to his ideal city. Plato considers that poetry is a threat, a danger, threatening his ideal city. Ordered as this is in a strict hierarchy, his city is moduled by or is set in a kind of hierarchy, تسلسل هرمي الشكل, whereby the guardians in this hierarchy, in this ideal city of Plato, we have a hierarchy, تسلسل هرمي للحكم للسلطة. On top of that hierarchy, we have the guardians. The philosophers are the guardians, and their helpers, the soldiers. So the first class, the top class of society consists of first, the philosophers, who call themselves the guardians of the society, and their helpers, who are the soldiers. This class comprise an elite, okay, an elect minority, a chosen minority, an elected minority, which rules over, okay, the bottom class, the lower class, which rules over a large majority of farmers, craftsmen, and money makers. The money makers are the capitalists, الرأسماليين. So in this state, in Plato's state, we have two classes. In this hierarchy, we have two classes. The first section of the first class, we have the guardians, the philosophers, helped by the soldiers. And then the lower class, we have the farmers, craftsmen, and capitalists or money makers. The program of education that he lays out for the rulers or the guardians, Plato sets a program of education. He tries to educate the rulers, the guardians, and their helpers. This program consists of gymnastics, العاب and music or poetry. Okay? The Greek word music, of course, the word music means the art of muses. As its form suggests, refers broadly to any art. Music means any art over which the muses preside. Preside means rule or control. Any art controlled by the muses, including poetry, letters. Letters, of course, means at the time prose fiction, and music. Just how seriously Plato takes the threat of poetry is signaled by the fact that it is music, which primarily defines the function of guardianship. How does he define music in that? He says, and I quote, "It is here in music that our guardians, the philosophers, must build their guardhouse and post of watch. The guardians must pay attention, very critical attention to music, to poetry." Plato advocates an open and strict censorship of poetry on the grounds of, very, very important, please underline this. Plato criticizes. The word censorship means criticism. Plato criticizes, and indeed it is a very harsh criticism. Plato criticizes poetry, but why? On what grounds? Number one, for what reasons? Number one, the falsity of its claims. The falsity of its claims. The claims of poetry are false, and representations regarding both gods and men. So the way poetry represents gods and men, people, this way is false. Number two of the reasons why Plato criticizes poetry, number two, its corruptive effect on character. He means its negative effect on people, on the character of people. Number three, its disorderly complexity, its disorganized or chaotic, okay, it's disorganized or chaotic complexity. It's very complex. Poetry is very complex and disorganized as well. And encouragement of individualism. poetry encourages individualism, الفردية في التعبير. Okay? In the sphere of sensibility, يعني regarding, okay, the realm, the world of sensibility, the world of perceptions, الأحاسيس أو الإدراك, and feelings as well. Socrates stresses that poets mustn't present the gods, he says mustn't. Poets must not present the gods as deceitful. So the poets describes gods in their poetry, and the different poems they compose as being deceitful because they compare these poets to men who are deceitful. They mustn't present the gods as deceitful. Why? Since there is no lying poet in God. God, the muse, isn't lying, is not a liar. This phrase suggested that poetry by its very nature, poetry in essence is a falsifying rhetorical activity, as he says. A falsifying, يعني, it means corruptive. The word falsifying here means corruptive. Rhetorical activity, aesthetic art. It's a corruptive aesthetic art. What also emerges here is a conflict between philosophy and poetry. In the right to name the divine, it means in the right, to describe the divine, the gods, to authorize a particular vision of the divine world. It means to approve a particular point of view, vision of the divine world of the gods. Why all this? For poetry, in poetry, that world is presented as an anthropomorphic. He describes this world, the world of poetry, as being, pay attention to this word, anthropomorphic. It means having human traits. Anthropomorphic means having human traits. The world of poetry has human traits. Anthropomorphic projection of human values centered on self-interest. The world of poetry is steeped and is based on self-interest, selfishness, individuality. A world of dark chance. Dark chance here means ill intentions, نوايا سيئة أو شريرة. Irrational, يعني unreasonable, influx, it means unstable, changing, all of which are negative descriptions of poetry. And divide of a unifying structure. Divide of, it means empty of. It doesn't have a unifying structure. It is loose. منحل. All of which are negative descriptions of poetry. The project of philosophy, on the other hand, according to Plato, the aim of philosophy, according to Plato, in Plato's hands, is to stabilize that world. To stabilize the world which has been shaken by poetry. To stabilize that world, drawing all of its scattered elements, gathering all of its scattered, all of its divided elements, into the form of order and unity. Order and unity, under which alone they can be posited and presented as absolute, as perfect, and transcendent. Transcendent means sublime, superior. On page number 99, move to page number 99. The first paragraph in the middle of the page. We now approach the heart of Plato's overall argument concerning justice and poetry, the relationship between justice and poetry in Plato's state, ideal state. The definition of justice in the state is reached in book number 9. Justice, he says that justice is a condition where each one man must perform one social service in the state for which his nature was best adapted. This is Plato's own definition of justice. Predictably, accordingly, justice in an individual is defined as a condition of the soul where the several parts of his soul, where the several parts perform each their own task, and where reason rules, where reason, the logic, not the emotions. Okay? Reason is the realm in which philosophy works, but emotions is the realm where poetry works. In political terms, and this is very, very important, pay attention to this. In political terms, poetry's greatest crime, the greatest crime of poetry, is its refusal or inability to confine itself to one kind of task. Poetry has many tasks, performs many roles, many functions, and this is its greatest crime. It is always changeable, changing. Plato urges that the same man who is a poet ought not to imitate many things. So he presumes or says that a poet imitates many things, many objects in nature, many human feelings maybe. Any poetic imitation involving manifold forms will, says Socrates, will be ill suited to our polity. Such expressions of emotions are not suitable to be found in our polity, which means our regime, our government. Okay? Because there is no twofold or manifold man among us. Everyone in this state has a single role, a single function, not manifold. Okay? Not many functions. Since every man does only one thing, according to their own definition of justice. Plato then arrives at the renowned passage. This is one of the most important passages in the history of Western philosophy, written by Plato in his Republic, the Republic book, Republic, urging banishment, in which he calls for the banishment, the exiling, okay, إبعاد أو إقصاء أو نفي, okay, banishment of the manifold poet. The poet should be banished or exiled. Why? He explains in this very important quotation by saying that. Let's read together. If a man who was capable by his cunning of assuming every kind of shape and imitating all things, he means the poet, should arrive in our city, if any poet arrives in our city, bringing with himself the poems, the disease, he means a disease, the poems which he wished to exhibit, to perform, to say to the people, We, he means we traditionally, we should fall down and worship him as a holy and wondrous and delightful creature. He expects to be treated at that. That people will kneel down in front of his poems and worship him, this poet, as a holy and wondrous, means a marvelous and delightful creature, but should say to him, no, we mustn't do that. We must say to him that there is no man of that kind among us in our city. No man will have the right to live among us in this city. Nor is it lawful for such a man to arise among us. He mustn't stay, and we should send him away to another city to be banished. After pouring myrrh, you know the myrrh? The myrrh is the oil of trees. Myrrh down over his head. We should pour myrrh, اللي هو بنسميه زيت مر, over his head, and crowning him, put over his head, okay, with fillets of wool, slices of fleece, wool, as a kind of humiliation, a symbol of disgrace, okay, ذل وإذلال وخزي وعار, كرمز لذلك يعني. This general charge against poetry is elucidated in book number 10, where Plato presents the poet as a most marvelous sophist. Of course, the sophist is a Greek philosopher, is a skeptic philosopher, of course, you know, as we mentioned before in one of the lectures at our faculty, the word sophist. So the poet as a most marvelous sophist, and a truly clever and wondrous man, who makes all the things that all handicraftsmen severally produce. He is so crafty. The political implication here is that poetry can have no definable and therefore limited. Poetry is indefinable, cannot be defined. Okay, its borders are infinite, are not limited. Okay, have no definable function in a state ordered according to a strict hierarchy, remember, okay, of unexchangeable function. He has no place among us in this hierarchical city-state, country. Poetry literally doesn't know its place because it doesn't know its function. It has no specific function. He goes on to explain that it spreads its influence limitlessly. It has a limitless influence. It can influence anyone, anywhere, and thus dissolving social relations. Poetry can thus dissolve social relations, the relationships that exist among the people of one society. As it pleases. It means whenever في أي وقت, and recreating the relationships within one society from its own store of imagination, of emotion, from its own store of inspired wisdom. Of course, this kind of wisdom is inspired from gods of poetry, whose opacity to reason, whose obscurity to reason, to the logic. Okay, it forms a kind of mist. Whose opacity to reason, it forms, as I just said, a kind of mist in the front of our perceptions, okay, renders it resistant to classification and definition, cannot be defined or classified. In this sense, poetry is the incarnation of indefinability, تجسد اللا محدودية أو اللا هدفية, and the limits of reason. It is in its nature rebel. So he accuses any poet as being a rebel. And poetry is a kind of rebellion, a asherber. When someone asherbs another, he steals the power of that person, takes away his power. So poetry, or a poet, is a rebel, a asherber, which desires to rule. Poetry desires to rule over people, and as such it is the most potent threat to the throne of philosophy, to our throne as philosophers, to Plato and Socrates. It's a strong threat to us, which is philosophy, which is also the throne of polity. Philosophy is the throne of the regime in the state of the philosopher king. In this state in which we as philosophers are kings, ruling the country. In political terms, Plato sees poetry as pandering primarily, calling primarily to a democratic constitution, a constitution or a policy or a government based on a democratic constitution, a democratic form of government. Like democracy, poetry fosters genuine individuals. Poetry, it means that poetry supports genuine individuals with genuine emotional qualities. Manifold men who are the poets, who are stuffed with differences, who are filled with differences, okay? Not static, but changing, ever changing, and resist the reduction of their social function. Poets resist the reduction of their social function. They have no single function, but many functions, or indeed their natural pretension into one exclusive dimension, one exclusive perspective. No, poets are manifold. Also, like democracy, poetry nurtures all parts of the soul. What are those parts of the soul? They are the emotions. They feed their emotions, enriches the emotions, refusing obeisance to the law of reason, refusing to respect, to obey reason. By implication, it means that poetry itself is inspired by the greed for liberty. It means that poetry itself is stimulated by the inclination, the greed, the inclination for liberty, for freedom of reason, okay, which is the hallmark of a democratic society. This stimulation against, or this stimulation toward the inclination of liberty, okay, is the official mark of any democratic society. Finally, this is very important, on page number 101. In conclusion, at the bottom of the page, in conclusion, Plato's indictment of poetry, Plato's accusation of poetry. If I ask you, why does Plato accuses poetry? Why does he condemn poets? Why does he criticize poets? Okay. His condemnation, his indictment has been on page number 102, has been based on the reasons why Plato condemns poets are, number one, or poetry, number one, its intrinsic expression of falsehood, its innate or internal expression of falsehood. Remember that the poets commit many mistakes by describing the gods with false descriptions. Number two, its intrinsic operation. By its, we refer to poetry. Its intrinsic operation in the realm of imitation, It depends on imitation, imagination, not the reason. Number 3, it's combination of a variety of functions, because it imitates many functions, many abilities, many objects in the world, many human natures and emotions. 4, it's appeal to the lower aspects of the soul. What are those lower aspects of the soul? Such as emotion. So the lower aspects of the soul are, one of them is emotion and appetite. By the word appetite, he means sexual appetite. Okay, sexual appetite. Those are the lower aspects of the soul, emotion and appetite, or sexual appetite. And number 5, the fifth reason of his condemnation of poetry, its expression of irreducible particularity and multiplicity rather than unity. It means poetry expresses irreducible particularity. The word irreducible, it means cannot be reduced. Particularity, it means limitedness. Okay? It is unlimited. And multiplicity, of course, if it is unlimited, so it is multiplicit. Rather than unity, it is not unified within a single structure. The notion of imitation, in fact, complements truth as the basis of Plato's opposition of philosophy and poetry. Well, in book number 10, the poet is held up as a sophist, a marvelous handicraftsman who can make anything in the world. And what the poet imitates is, of course, the appearance. Pay attention to this, very important. Plato believes that what the poet imitates, so the poet is an imitator. What the poet imitates is, of course, the appearance. He imitates an external reality, not the original reality. The appearance, not the reality itself. The appearance of things, how things appear to the eye, since he merely imitates what others actually produce. So, whom does this poet really imitate? The final paragraph is very, very important on page number 102. Plato elaborates his famous triad. He gives you an example of a triad. Of course, the word triad means threesome. Threesome, a three-related thing. Something composed of three things connected by relationship. He gives you an example to explain what does he mean by his definition of a poet as being an imitator. We find the 3 beds. Imagine that there are 3 beds. 3 beds. Asirra. One of these beds existing in nature, in our world, okay, which is made by God. This nature has been descended onto earth from the heavens to the earth, made by God to humans, and is found in nature. Okay. Another bed, which is the work of the carpenter. A carpenter observes this godly or divine bed in nature, and so he tries to imitate the bed made by God. So this carpenter is an imitator of God. He imitates the work of God. And a third bed, the work of the painter or poet. A painter who paints or draws the bed made by the carpenter, or the poet who describes the bed made by the carpenter. Hence, the carpenter imitates the real bed, the pure reality of the divine entity of the gods. And the painter or the poet imitates the physical bed made by the carpenter. So the poet's work then, like that of the rhapsody, you remember the rhapsody, the singer or the interpreter or the performer, the poet's work, like that of the rhapsody, is the imitation of imitation. The poet's work is an imitation of an imitation. The poet is an imitator of imitators, because the poet imitates the bed made by the carpenter, and the carpenter imitates the bed made by God. Of course, the bed here is just a metaphor. It can be applied to any other object in nature, maybe human emotions even. Thank you for your good listening, and see you inshallah قريبا soon. Thank you.